Determinism seems to be an inevitable reality for people who examine the nature of physical causality. Pierre-Simon Laplace, an early 19th century physicist, infamously said that if a demon were to know the location and velocity of every single atom in existence, then they could predict the future with perfect accuracy. Many people have claimed that it is an unavoidable scientific reality that atoms affect atoms in a predictable mechanistic sequence, and that this sequence pervades everything in existence, including human behavior. You are obviously a product of your environment, and so your thoughts and your feelings and your desires and everything in between arise out of your interaction with that environment. And so it seems you are conditioned and indeed ultimately determined by the causal sequence of events that constitute your existence and indeed the moment that you inhabit right now. Attempting to lodge free will in the middle of it seems an arduous and probably impossible task. So, we might be inclined to conclude that determinism must be true. Yet, in meditating on what determinism actually means and what its ramifications are, we see pretty quickly that it is, by nature, an absurd and untenable conclusion to draw. There are many problems that arise from determinism, problems pertaining to ethics and morality, to art and creativity, to jurisprudence and how we run our legal systems, and indeed basically every aspect of human life. But before we get to any of those, we see most primordially and most destructively, determinism obliterates the possibility of a legitimate use of reason itself. After all, if physical determinism is true and all we experience in our conscious thought and decision making is just the process of atoms knocking into one another, then human beings lack the ability to consciously and rationally draw conclusions from logical problems, even as simple as 2 + 2 = 4. Under the basic principles of determinism and classical atomistic physics, how could atoms causing each other in a blind, mechanistic, non-intentional motion in any way pause before a logical problem like 2 + 2 and then rationally consider the possibilities and honestly come to a reasonable conclusion? Any human being who attempts to figure out the solution to a problem as simple as 2 + 2 won't be able to just simply use their ability for abstract reasoning, but will instead have to blindly hope that every single event in cosmic history has turned out exactly as it needed to for the absolutely serendipitous conclusion of 4. That would, to be clear, be much more difficult than winning the lottery. It's absolutely blind luck. The chances are so diminished they are practically nugatory. And even if you did happen to get the correct answer of 4, you wouldn't have any way to review that answer and assess whether or not it was correct, because even your review of the answer to the question would be determined mechanistically and without rational intention. The same goes for quite literally every single truth claim, including, lo and behold, the claim that determinism itself is true. Determinism is inherently a self-defeating position, and not only that, but it obliterates practically everything else that we know about philosophy or science, because it prevents us from knowing that our reason directs us to the truth at all. So we have an aporia. On the one hand, it seems that neurophysiology and classical Newtonian physics points to the necessity of determinism, and yet at the very same time, determinism seems philosophically indefensible. The question is, where do we go from here? In steps Henri Bergson, who prompts us to start all over again. Think about how most people will formulate this debate. The libertarian and the determinist will both take a similar model of a decision to try and analyze. Let's say you're deciding whether to eat an apple or a banana in the morning. Here, both libertarian and determinist presume that we have a consistent line of causality leading up to that point, an isolated subject who's going to make the decision, and then in this case, two possible ways forward, a fork in the road. Pretty simply, the libertarian will say that the decision that the subject makes is free, and if they wanted to, they were perfectly capable of eating the banana. And on the other hand, the determinist will say that wasn't a possibility, they were always going to eat the apple. This is where we need to pay close attention. In accepting this model of decision-making, the libertarian has already lost. Or more positively, the the determinist has already won. Why? Because we have already set ourselves within a causal sequence, establishing cause and effect both before and after. There will always be a cause, or more likely a set of causes, that influence and establish the possibility and indeed the result of one decision or the other. And those causes, the causes of the decision and its effects itself, are implicated within a chain that, as I say, stretches all the way back and all the way forward. Many attempts to try and cultivate a space for free will in this causal sequence seem to try and stuff something else into the bumping of the atoms, something that's typically unscientific or that there's no evidence for, or that ultimately results in being what Gilbert Ryle called in his critique of Descartes, a ghost in the machine. I don't think that any libertarian or even a kind of compatibilist could actually win this debate once they've accepted this model of decision making. So, this is all very well and good, you might be thinking, a win for the determinist, but it hasn't actually solved our problem. We still have the impossibility of determinism to deal with according to the strictures of logic. This is, to be sure, a paradox. Now, Bergson actually pointed out that paradoxes can be a good sign that we have been doing something wrong. He highlighted, to prove his point, one of the most famous paradoxes in the history of Western philosophy, Zeno's paradox of the arrow. Zeno argued that when an archer fires their arrow at a target, the distance that that arrow covers is a quantifiable, measurable distance, let's say 10 meters. However, because it's mathematically quantifiable, that means it's necessarily divisible. So Zeno divides the distance in half, and then in half again, and then again, and again, and again, and so on ad infinitum. Zeno points out that the quantifiable distance between the archer and the target is really infinite. There's always more space to be discovered between the arrow and its target, even if that is an absolutely minute, tiny bit of space. And yet this obviously contradicts our sense experience, which watches the arrow be fired and hit the target without any sort of infinite delay. How does Bergson solve this problem? Very simply, he argues that the paradox arises from a fault in the method. It's because we believe that motion, in this case the motion of the arrow, is a quantifiable effect that we go wrong. We believe that the way we carve the world up into quantifiable divisions, into things like distance or time or temperature or whatever else, are actual reports on the true nature of reality, of life. However, Bergson argues this isn't actually the case. Our real experience of the world is one of unity, an abiding continuity in our awareness. Everything that we know is actually a single fabric of consciousness, an ocean of being through which all our particular experiences pass. But it's the habit of our mind to carve up the world, and a very useful habit, Bergson is clear to argue, not a bad one by nature, but it is still our habit to carve up the world into different objects, into that cup over there and this lamp over here. These mental divisions are then mistaken for metaphysical realities, and we forget that the universe is actually a flowing melody of experience, all within an abiding unity, rather than simply an array of dead, material, inert objects, things that we can count and so mathematically divide. This is the very same approach that Bergson will use to solve the problem of free will and determinism. That is, all the ways in which we concretely differentiate the world into discrete units are simply not real, at least beyond a provisional pragmatic utility. Let's return to the fork in the road model. Remember how we said that the determinist will win in this case? Well, that's because determinism is the conclusion that we necessarily come to when we think within the terms of our quantifiable representation of the world. Bergson is very clear that in our actual experience of the world, which is that locus where the question of freedom is actually important, things aren't static, enclosed, unimpeachable monads or objects that just exist by standing alongside one another in the world. In consciousness, everything is experienced in a unity of knowing, albeit a unity that presents us with constant difference. To repeat the metaphor, being alive is like listening to a song. If you pick apart the particular notes of the melody, you will miss the essence of what's being played to you altogether. You will miss the fact that they are just parts reflecting an overall unity. Most importantly, for the question at hand, one thing that belongs to this world of quantifiable multiplicity, as Bergson calls it, that is, the differentiation that we make up in our heads, is the notion of a cause itself. We watch as an arrow flies through the sky, and then link it in our memory with the thing we saw just before it, which was the archer letting go of the bow, and thereby create the connection in our heads that ultimately we call cause and effect. Some of you might be reminded of David Hume here. But if we really did see the world as a set of discrete events which we label cause and effect, then we would see the archer drawing his bow, firing the arrow's movement and the arrow's hitting his target as all completely isolated occurrences. What memory represents for Bergson is the storage of our unified consciousness. Everything that we have ever known in existence passes through the filter of our awareness, our durée, as he calls it. But in our habit of carving up the world into cause and effect, we also carve it up into time, and we start to anticipate different parts of the world as being over there in the past like a cause, and over there in the future like an effect, even though in our experience we have never known anything but the present. Hence why the fork in the road model is a misrepresentation of what it is actually like to be free. It assumes that being free is simply trying to force something extra into the physical causality of atoms. Bergson argues instead that freedom is not just a ghost in the machine floating somewhere in that tight-knit order, but rather it's a more immediate reality. Determinism is what follows from an exclusive survey of material, physical causality. But if that mechanistic causality is itself seen to be nothing but a projection of the mind rather than a real reflection of reality, then the necessity of determinism slips away. So, at last, you ask, we've changed the model, but what is freedom in that case? It might be quite difficult to wrap your head around it at first, especially if implicitly or explicitly you're still waiting for an explanation in the terms of the fork in the road model. I would answer, as simply as I can, that freedom is exactly where you think it is. In your immediate experience, in your consciousness, that essence within you that allows you to deliberate upon, engage, and ultimately come to conclusions in relation to rational problems. That part of you that allows you to select certain ends for your desires based on a certain perceived rational preference to those ends. That's it. It doesn't need to be forced into the picture of material causality like a Procrustean bed, because it's simply categorically different from it. As such, in spite of the attempts of the reductive physicalists, free will doesn't really need a Copernican revolution. It's not some illusion that we need to work to reduce to just inert material mechanistic elements. It is, rather for Bergson, the most primordial and immediate reality of your being. You are freedom. Think of how, say, Alex O'Connor argues against the existence of free will. He suggests that the self is either subject to predetermined fixed laws and so isn't free, or it's subject to sheer spontaneity and so isn't free. But in both cases, he first posits the existence of a self, distinguished, isolated from the rest of the world, and then only considers the possibility of freedom as a secondary thing added on to this self. But if we remove this illusion and cease thinking about ourselves as mere particular objects in space and time, limited by our bodies and our psychologies, then we can recognize freedom as what we are, an openness to all things, an awareness of the intense difference and diversity of existence. As such, and here's one of the important implications of this model of freedom, our freedom can increase or diminish depending on the degree to which we open ourselves up to the world. The more we can, as it were, clear the runway of our experience, ceasing to cling to those particular objects that we formulate in our quantitative representations, then the freer we become. It's no surprise that this is the model of freedom, one of ascent through a cessation of clinging to worldly things, that mystical thinkers as significant as Plato, Plotinus, and Augustine all recommended. Bergson provides us with a model of freedom that recognizes that all our debates about free will and determinism are mired in unnecessary problems and misconceptions. They are the result of a category error, a failure of methodology, an inability to establish what we're talking about before we go on to talk about it. The truth of freedom is much more intimate and much less theoretical. Freedom is something you are, not something you just have, let alone something you abstractly pontificate on long after a decision has been made. All in all, that is, a true investigation into the nature of freedom is an investigation into the nature of yourself. Thank you for watching. Please do consider subscribing as this channel begins its nascent growth, and please do comment, because I'd love to hear suggestions for videos, which I'll definitely do, as well as just discuss the ideas with you, which I love to do. Take care.